With the release of the Nintendo Switch Online Services subscription model, also came the release of 20 NES games being offered for free for any subscriber. Now, if you're a regular, sane person, you probably don't have the time to play 20 games and decide which ones you want to keep playing and which ones you're going to push to the side. After all, the games may be free, but your time is valuable. Well, lucky for you, I am not a sane person. In the past year and change, I've reviewed nearly 100 PlayStation Plus games that are offered for free with a PS Plus subscription each and every single month. So when Nintendo announced a subscription model, with free games being offered as part of that service, I figured this kind of video might be right up my alley. So in today's episode of The Golden Bolt, by far the biggest one I've ever done, I'll be reviewing every NES game currently available on the Nintendo Switch. Yes, all 20 of them, and I'll be reviewing the NES app itself. If you want to skip to a specific review, I'll have all of them timestamped down in the description below. Without further ado, let's dive right in. Before we discuss the games being emulated, let me first discuss the Switch's emulation itself. If you have an NES Classic, the Switch quite literally uses just that. It's not a rebuilt emulator or anything. As we currently understand it, Nintendo took the NES Classic's code and plopped it onto the system. As such, there are zero functional differences between the two. In fact, the Switch actually loads the games ever so slightly faster than the NES Classic, or even an original NES. But you wouldn't notice that unless you played the two systems back to back. I know this because that's exactly what I did. Because the Classic is about as spot on as a ROM box can get to playing these games on the original hardware, and because a dozen of the Switch's 20 launch games for the online are already on the NES Classic, I actually bought one specifically for this video so that I could directly compare the two. I expected that something would go wrong with at least one of the games on the Switch, but surprisingly they all run perfectly, or arguably even better than perfectly. This does mean that I played all of these games twice for what ended up being no real reason, but hey, you gotta do what you gotta do to be thorough. It worked in my favor anyway, because using an NES Classic helped me ensure that I had substantial time to beat the games and fully formulate my thoughts for this video. These are still the same games 30 years later after all, it doesn't matter where you play them. As such, full disclosure, much of the footage you'll see here is actually from an NES Classic, with some Switch footage sprinkled in specifically to show off gameplay of the Switch's unique NES gimmick, the online play. In my experience, the online worked without a hitch, and I ran into almost no latency when playing with a few different people from across the country. Now, your mileage may vary, and I've heard some people had some latency problems when even playing in an online server by themselves, but at least for me, this was smoother than I ever expected it to be. You could play two-player games like Balloon Fight cooperatively, play the sports games competitively, take turns playing single-player games, or even assist a friend in fighting hidden secrets in The Legend of Zelda using this on-screen cursor. You can also just use the hand to get in the way and be a nuisance, or just clap. Forever. You're paying $4 a month for this. For those of you that haven't watched my Plus One series of PS Plus reviews before and may want to know more about how I reviewed these games, make sure you save your questions until the end, as I'll also be discussing my review methodology and touch on the Switch's NES app itself, how it looks, the bonus features, and so on. Alright, with all that said, let's dive right into the meat of the video. Released in arcades in 1984 and ported to the NES the next year, Balloon Fight is a game all about being precise with imprecise mechanics. You take control of this little balloon fighter guy, competing against a number of opponents in what is essentially mid-air jousting. By pressing either the A or B button, you'll swing your arms and float upward, giving you the chance to get an advantage on your opponents. If you come in from a higher elevation and smack into the opponent's balloon, it'll pop and he'll float down to the ground below. But you have to be careful, because if they get the jump on you, they'll pop one of your two balloons. Losing a balloon will make it harder for you to climb into the air as quickly, which can put you at even more of a disadvantage, and losing both of your balloons will take away one of your 3 lives. After enemies hit the ground, they might just sit there and wait for you to land on them and finish them off, or they may pump up a new, differently colored balloon, becoming a more difficult enemy in the process. Additionally, as enemies are parachuting down, you have the opportunity to clip them out of the air again for double points, so that they don't have a chance to blow up a new balloon at all. That's a whole lot of words to describe a very simple game, and thankfully the mechanics click with you pretty much instantly. Just make sure you don't get eaten by a giant fish or hit by lightning. There are about a dozen different level layouts in Balloon Fight, and like some other games we'll cover in a bit, the screen wraps around here. So you can exit stage left and pop back up immediately on the other side of the screen for some sneak attacks. Like I said a moment ago, there's not much to this game, but it's still surprisingly fun, and it has a 2-player mode where you can work together with a friend to go through all the levels. And don't forget, that 2-player mode works online now. That all said, there still is one more mode we have to talk about, and that is Balloon Trip, where you'll be put in some incredibly tight situations, collecting balloons and moving as far through the spark-filled auto-scrolling level as possible. Even better, you're moving from right to left here, which runs counter to most 2D platformers that you've probably played, so that might throw you off ever so slightly. This mode is exactly what I mean by being precise with imprecision. The space between sparks is sometimes so tight that one wrong button press, or a button press at the wrong time, will float you up or down just 1 pixel too far into instant death. You'll find yourself manipulating the balloon fighter's arm flapping in ways that might leave a bit of sweat on your brow, throwing him into sure death and then somehow coming out in one piece. Balloon Trip is as fun as it is frustrating, in the same way that Balloon Fight as a whole is as fun as it is brief. It's good as a momentary throwback to simpler times, but it's not going to keep you hooked for hours on end unless, like in the good old NES days, you are for some reason limited to just this and 1 or 2 other games. Obviously, since we have 20 games to work with right now, that's not the case, so I would recommend you play it with a friend to get the most out of it. 1983's Baseball is widely considered one of the games that helped the NES's first year at bat, and one of the key reasons that the system performed as well as it did early on. In 1983, this game was probably very good. 35 years later, oh my god, this has to be the slowest baseball game out there, and that's saying a lot because it's baseball. This game has not aged well at all, particularly with the advent of 4-button controllers. The 4 face buttons of an SNES controller and all modern controllers has become a necessity for baseball simulation games. In this game, with the NES's 2-button setup, you have to aim the D-pad in the direction of the base you want to throw at, and it just feels clunky by comparison. Even pitches feel strange, although in a slightly more satisfying way, as you can control the direction of your pitch on the fly after you've already thrown it. That aside, the game is more or less fully featured as a baseball game, or at least as fully featured as you'd get from a game made in 1983. There's no franchise mode or anything, but you can bunt, you can steal, the only thing you can't do is control your team while they're chasing a ball in the outfield. Instead, you have to watch as they pathetically run towards it and hope that they're actually fast for once. Spoilers, they are never fast enough. This puts a good amount of the game's gameplay in the hands of what may as well be luck. That's true for both sides of this game too, as while you can for the most part control whether your basemen run or stay when you're at bat, their speed is predetermined and also seems to be open to some variation in my experience. Thankfully, there don't seem to be any errors in this game, well, at least the baseball variety, so you don't have to worry about the AI messing up any more than they already do. I played a full 48-minute game of baseball, and it was a teensy bit painful by the end because of how slow everything is in this game. And I say that having won a game where both teams scored at least 20 points, which should be thrilling as far as baseball goes. Unless you have some heavy nostalgia for this title, there is very little reason to play it nowadays. There's quite literally nothing to do other than play a single game, and the teams you pick don't even matter at all. At that point, you might as well just bust out Wii Sports and play baseball there. I would pass on this one unless you absolutely need your baseball fix on the Switch and don't want to buy one of the other few baseball games available on the system. Donkey Kong, the game that kickstarted the Nintendo we know and love today, arguably the first true platformer ever released, and a game I have a feeling a lot of Switch owners have never actually played, not counting Mario Odyssey's New Donk Festival. While this isn't the 1981 arcade original, the NES port is functionally identical, minus a few small tweaks. You play as Mario, or back then known as Jumpman, as he attempts to save his girlfriend Pauline from Donkey Kong's grasp. The NES version proceeds through 3 stages, as Mario climbs the construction site and jumps over hazards like barrels in order to reach his beloved. In the arcade version, there was also a 4th stage, which, along with the game's few cutscenes, was taken out of the NES release due to the cartridge space limitations at the time. If you can successfully make your way to the final level and remove all of the rivets holding DK's platform up, Mario and Pauline will reunite, and the game will loop back to the first stage, only this time harder. These harder stages are also known as Game B on the title screen, in case you want to skip right to the hard stuff. If you can continue looping through the stages, the game will continue to get more and more difficult, with DK throwing more hazards your way until you inevitably perish. There's also a 2-player option for both Game A and Game B, where you'll take turns trying to conquer the construction tower and jockey for the high score. It's worth noting, in case you're used to the arcade version, that the NES release is much easier. And in my opinion, it's also slightly easier to control as well. The second part might be placebo, or it might be because I haven't played the arcade version in probably 10 years, but Mario's jumps just feel a little bit better. Well, I guess it could also be because my most recent memory of the arcade version was having to beat it twice in order to fully complete DK64. That part was not fun, but at least it gave me the skills to beat it here in just a few minutes without much trouble. If you haven't played any version of Donkey Kong before, I would argue it's just about a must, so that you can get a feel for both Mario and DK's origins firsthand. If you have played it before already, unless you're really itching to go back, you can probably pass on it. I would say just play DK94 on the Game Boy, or the seemingly inevitable Game Boy Classic whenever that comes out. That's a far more complete game than what we have right here. Released in 1987 in arcades, Double Dragon is usually credited with driving the explosion of the beat-em-up genre. Naturally, its NES port holds up incredibly well to the high bar that statement sets, although not without some cutbacks. The arcade's simultaneous 2-player co-op was cut due to system limitations, and the game feels a teensy bit barren since you only ever fight 2 people on screen at once. Double Dragon on the NES makes up for this in a few ways though, including an all-new experience system, which unveils new moves that Billy Lee can perform after leveling up. While you start off with basic punches and kicks, later on you'll have stronger grappling moves, or just the ability to knee your opponent in the face a lot until he dies. There are only 4 levels in this game, and most of them are pretty short. Brevity aside though, they are packed full of quality, featuring sections where you have to climb ladders, dodge thrown weapons such as knives or dynamite, or fight while on a moving conveyor belt. Even better, you can pick up those weapons and throw them right back to inflict even more punishment. Although it's simple, it's all very ahead of its time. After all, there's only so much you can do with 2 buttons, and Double Dragon uses those buttons in many different ways just to add as many moves as possible. For example, the jump button is actually 2 buttons, requiring you to press A and B simultaneously. Double Dragon also has a Mode B, but this time it's actually totally different from Mode A. Mode B is a 1 or 2 player fighting game where you'll take on a mirror of the character you pick. Any of the 6 characters in the main game are usable here, and most of them have a slightly unique moveset. Be warned though, if you're fighting the computer, they all have a huge health advantage, which will probably do you in a good few times. While it's obviously not the best fighting game, Mode B is still a fun time, and that statement can be stretched to the entire game as well. It's not going to be the best beat-em-up you ever played, but it holds up remarkably well. I do wish we could have gotten that 2-player simultaneous co-op though, but hey, I guess that's what the sequels were for. I think it's worth playing, especially considering you'll probably have gotten to see all 4 levels within 30 minutes to an hour. There is another beat-em-up on this list that I would recommend more, but we'll get to that one in a little bit. After all of the thrilling fighting, climbing, and baseballing that we've been through so far, a nice relaxing puzzle game sounds like just what the doctor ordered. That was unintentional, but you know what? I'm gonna roll with it. Dr. Mario is next up on our list. This 1990 game, and all of its sequels for that matter, function on a very simple premise. As Dr. Mario, you must kill all of the viruses in a stage by matching 4 of the same color together, using Dr. Mario's likely illegally obtained pills. Until game theory proves otherwise, I'm assuming these are opioids. There are only 3 colors that you have to worry about, red, blue, and yellow, but each pill has any combination of those 3 colors on each half of the pill. You'll have to plan your pill popping appropriately so that your drugs don't pile up and overflow the screen, causing a fatal overdose, or as this game calls it, a game over. I'm on to you, Mario. There are multiple speeds for you to play with as you become more and more adept at the game, as well as different difficulty levels for you to begin on. Let me tell you, this game is as addicting as the opioids that Mario's dropping. Sometimes I feel that Dr. Mario even usurps Tetris in pure fun factor. A single casual game turns into an hour, and one more game turns into 5 more games, until suddenly it's tomorrow. Considering how much time I've put into most of the Dr. Mario games over the years, I only meant to record basic footage and judge any issues with the NES's emulation on Switch, but I ended up playing for half an hour by accident. Despite putting dozens and dozens of hours into this series, I still found a way to get lost in the fun of Dr. Mario. If that's not a testament to how good it is, I don't know what is. I think Dr. Mario is worth playing anytime, so this is a great choice for the Switch's NES library. The only way I wouldn't recommend you play it is if you already have a newer version of Dr. Mario on another system, if only because future iterations eventually became more fully featured. As short as it was, I loved Dr. Mario 64's story mode as a kid. It helped break up the gameplay ever so slightly, and playing against the CPU, while not as fun as playing against a friend, can still be fun by itself. And Miracle Cure's mission mode was a fun distraction as well. Either way, you really can't go wrong with any Dr. Mario game.
And if you do drugs, you go to hell before you die.
Released in North America as a launch title for the NES, I'm sure many of you have fond memories of Excitebike from when you were growing up. This motocross game contains 2 racing modes across 5 different tracks. The first mode is just a time trial, where you can learn the courses without having to worry about any other racers, and Mode B is a full-on race. Well, not exactly, you're not actually racing the opponents, they're just sort of hazards for your time trial. In either mode, your goal is to place in 3rd or better in a race by beating the time posted in the corner of your screen so that you may progress to the next course. Tracks are full of several different hazards, such as mud, fences, or part of the road that cuts out 2 of the track's 4 lanes. While you're racing, you have to be mindful of a few different variables. First and foremost, you have to watch for obstacles on the lane you're on, and shift into another lane if necessary. In doing so, you've gotta be careful, because if you run into another racer, unless you're slightly ahead of them, you're going to crash and burn. Crashing, as well as overheating your engine, will slow you down immensely, although it doesn't necessarily bump you out of contention for 3rd place or higher. Thankfully, your engine won't overheat unless you abuse your turbo boost by holding down the B button. If you just accelerate using the A button and boost wisely, you'll be fine. The last thing you need to watch out for, and arguably the coolest thing about the base gameplay, is your bike's angle in midair. You can do flips and make your own tricks during the game's many jumps, but you want to make sure that you land parallel to the ground. If you land at the wrong angle on an inclined ramp, you'll at the very least slow down immensely and very likely crash and burn. The game's really fun once you get the hang of it, but it's also very limited by only having 5 tracks. That's where the 3rd and final mode, and the most fun part of the entire game, comes into play: the track editor. You can make and save your own custom courses to show off whenever your friends come over, or now just by playing online with your buddies. And you can try to make the coolest or hardest tracks imaginable. The editor is a bit clunky, but come on, this is an NES game. I'd be shocked if it wasn't clunky. You essentially move down the course bit by bit and then add the different track pieces by selecting the letter underneath. This means that if you want to make tracks quickly, you'll have to start memorizing which letters correspond to which pieces of the track. It's a super neat feature, and honestly, this makes the game for me. If it weren't for this, I would recommend playing Excitebike for maybe the 10 minutes it takes you to play all 5 tracks, but this could add a good amount of game time, even if there are absolutely some better track editors out there nowadays. Released as an arcade game in 1985 and later ported to the NES and several other platforms, Ghosts 'n Goblins is without a doubt the most brutal game on this list. If you want a true challenge, a game that is borderline unfair at times, the kind of game you'll be playing for months out of sheer spite, this is the game for you. After all, this is one of those games that was designed to eat as many of your quarters as possible in the arcade. Ghosts 'n Goblins is a simple platformer, and it only has 6 levels, but those levels are packed full of infinitely respawning enemies that really want you dead. When you start out, your only weapon is the infinite throwing spears that you can use to fight off these enemies, but later you can obtain different weapons that will replace that spear. Your character only has 2 hit points, and you only have 3 lives. If you game over, it's all the way back to the start of the game. Thankfully, each level is split up into chunks, and forgivingly throws you a bone in the form of a checkpoint if you do make it partway through a level. This is hardly a big help though, because you're still going to die, and die a lot. I'll fully admit that this is the game I can say the least about, because when recording footage, I only got to the end of level 1. I know for a fact that it only gets more difficult from there though, and if you want the true ending, you'd better be ready to beat this game twice. Thankfully, this is an old school game, so there is a level select cheat code available if you get tired of going all the way back to level 1. As far as difficult platformers go, I'll take Mega Man over Ghosts and Goblins any day. But obviously we don't have any Mega Man in our Switch NES lineup just yet, so if you're looking for a challenge, this might have to do. I definitely wouldn't recommend it unless you know you're up to the task though. Also known as the game that gave birth to the most famous cheat code in history, Gradius, or Gradius if you prefer to pronounce it that way, is another game known for its incredibly challenging difficulty. Unlike Ghosts and Goblins though, I would argue that Gradius' difficulty is fair. This bullet hell side-scrolling shoot-'em-up puts you in control of a spaceship known as the Vic Viper, as you shoot down hundreds upon hundreds of enemy ships. As you take down the waves of enemies that fly by, you'll collect these little power-up tokens, which act in a super unique way for this genre. Rather than giving you one specific ability or a random ability, collecting these power-ups adds to this little power-up meter on the bottom of your screen. The first time you get one, it will light up the speed-up power, and from there it will cycle onward to the next one and then the next one. The catch is that until you press the B button to activate whichever power-up you want, you haven't actually used the power-ups yet. This adds an incredible level of depth to an already hectic game as you work out your own personal strategies. Do you want to power up your speed a few times, or do you want to skip ahead so that you have missiles or lasers? It's entirely up to you, but as long as you don't get hit and lose a life, all of your powers will continue to stack, meaning that you can become a ridiculous machine of death in short fashion. Like I said though, that's only as long as you don't take a hit, and the enemies you're facing are often also ridiculous machines of death. There's a reason the Konami code started here, and it's because Gradius is just plain tough. You've got limited screen space to work with, and even in the first level, enemy shots and enemy ships will start giving you some really close calls. If you fly too close to the ground below or above you, you'll crash and lose a life too, and this adds so much more tension than it may sound like at first. You don't realize how much you rely on the edge of your screen to avoid damage in a pinch until you can't do just that. If you do decide you need a bit of an edge to make it through Gradius, using the Konami code on the pause screen, in case you somehow don't know, that's up, down, left, right, BA start, will deck you out immediately with a full suite of your powers, and I won't judge you if you do it, I promise. As a bit of a shmup fan, I'm a little bit ashamed that I hadn't played the granddaddy of them all until recently, but despite its age and its difficulty, Gradius is a must-play for anybody who likes this genre of game. Yet again, if you're up for a challenge, Gradius is more than ready to give you one. Outside of Rob, the Ice Climbers are possibly the Smash Bros. Character whose game has been played the least. I know I hadn't played this game before, and oh man, this is a rough one. Your goal in Ice Climber is to climb a vertical mountain broken up into several differently colored roads. Above you is usually ice that you'll have to jump into and break with your hammer so that you can find a path to the next row up. The catch is that once you've jumped up enough, the screen scrolls up with you and then locks in place, so if you miss a subsequent jump and fall back down after that, you'll lose a life. All the while, you're avoiding or smacking enemies such as birds, a big yeti that will bump up the entire screen if you're too slow, and these little fuzzy guys that will patch up any holes in the ice once they walk into them. It may not look like it at first, but the screen wraps around here as well, just like with Balloon Fight earlier, so you can freely move around the screen to position yourself for the best path up. The problem here is that Ice Climber is home to possibly the worst jump I've ever seen in a major NES game, and yes, that includes Castlevania's jumps. This jump is pretty much exclusively vertical, there's almost no horizontal momentum at all, and this leads to countless jumps where you absolutely should be in the clear, but you don't make it to the next level because the game decided to clip Nana or Popo through the platform. As you progress through Ice Climber's 32 levels, this only gets worse as it throws moving cloud platforms or even moving conveyor belts as your only path forward. You try jumping through these tiny holes and getting enough momentum to actually make it onto the next level while having to deal with enemies above you and moving platforms below you that are your only safety from a death pit. It's not like you can just take your time and wait on the clouds either, because only on the rows with the clouds on them does the game decide that you're completely prohibited from wrapping around the screen. While the game's concept is neat at first, it's just not fun. I even got completely stuck at one point due to the horrible jump and had to wait for the Yeti to mercy kill me. I genuinely don't recommend you play Ice Climber unless you really want to play every series featured with a fighter in Smash Bros. That's pretty much the only thing the game's good for now unless you really want a quick hit of nostalgia, but even then, there are many better nostalgia options offered here. Oh boy, another sports game. Well, thankfully, unlike baseball, ice hockey isn't painfully slow. In fact, it has 5 different speed options for players to choose from. There are also 6 different teams you can pick from, which only differ cosmetically, though I swear Canada's team is definitely better. Once you've selected your team, speed, and how long you want each of the game's 3 periods to last, you'll choose a class for each of the 4 players on your team. There are 3 different classes, each with slightly different speeds, shooting power, and success with the face-offs that open every hockey play. Play? Is it called a play? Whatever it's called. I'm very surprised with how in-depth this game goes, but then it is the latest release of all of the sports titles in this list, coming out in 1988, so I guess it does make some sense. The game is surprisingly fun, although definitely keep in mind that you need to hold down the A or B button before releasing to pass or shoot respectively. If you just tap the button instead, you'll pull a fake pass or shot to throw the opponents off. Funnily enough, that really only threw me off for most of my first game playing. What also threw me off is that you're simultaneously controlling both whichever player is flashing yellow and the goalie at all times. Once you get the hang of this, it stops being nearly as much of an issue, but for whatever reason it took me a good while to get used to playing defense with 2 players at once. When your opponent has the puck, you can press A when nearby to try and check them, and if you keep pressing A, you'll probably cause a fight between both teams. Whichever team mashes the A button less during the fight will be penalized, and the player that initiated that fight will be put in the penalty box. Yeah, that's right, this game even has penalty boxes, a few penalties, and if you tie at the end of regulation, you'll actually go into a penalty shot sudden death. I'm not a hockey guy by any means, but once you get past some of the clunkiness, this is a deceptively fun NES game. This one will definitely be a great game to play online with one of your friends, and plus it's not like there are any other hockey games you can play on Switch right now. Give it a shot, you might be surprised. What is there to say about The Legend of Zelda that hasn't already been said? It's one of the greatest, most lasting franchises of all time, and it all started in this 1986 top-down adventure. Zelda 1 tells you almost nothing, choosing to toss you into the world of Hyrule without even a sword so that you can figure it out yourself. The in-game map is Byzantine at best and labyrinthine at worst. The characters that you find very rarely in caves provide confusing, mistranslated, and often misleading dialogue. And speaking of those caves, there's practically no indication of which walls you should bomb, or later which trees you should burn with the candle item in order to find hidden caves. This game can be a frustrating nightmare for first-time players. Really, Zelda 1 has all of the makings of what people would call a bad game today. But Zelda 1 is not a bad game, just one with some dated design. There's something to be said about that addicting feeling of discovery that rushes over you when you do find a cave, a new power-up, or even better, a dungeon. This is the kind of game that you would play for months and months on end as a kid, discovering new secrets and sharing them around with your friends at school, and it turns Zelda into a social experience just as much as a game. That's a design philosophy that's not often used anymore, although Breath of the Wild did strip back decades of feature creep to operate with a very similar goal in mind. The result is that Zelda 1 is a product of its era, a game that everybody lists as one of the best games of all time without fully explaining why, and perhaps a game that you might not think you want to try if you haven't played it already. Well, I would suggest that you do give it a shot, with a very large asterisk on that statement. See, Zelda 1 came with a large manual, which included a much deeper story synopsis, explanations for items and enemies, and a partially filled-in map that shows far more detail than the in-game map. The manual even has a step-by-step guide that gets you to the first 2 dungeons. If you've ever played Zelda 1 without this, and you hated the game as a result, I would strongly suggest you come back again and try it with either a digital PDF of this manual, or even better, a more detailed guide for when you get stuck. Even if you come prepared, Zelda 1 can still be an incredibly difficult game due to the aged combat mechanics and the fact that when you die, you'll only restart with 3 hearts, but it's more than manageable if you have one of these with you. I know this because I used to be one of those Zelda 1 detractors until I did equip myself properly one day, and going in with even a little bit of assistance turned what I felt was a subpar experience into a surprisingly really fun one. The dungeons are, in my opinion, where the game shines, providing a much more compact experience with much more constant discovery than in the world, where once you've done a basic search, you probably won't find much more until you do start digging using one of those guides. With a guide of some sort, you'll be skipping past the game's occasional moments where you'll ask yourself how anybody was expected to find this particular dungeon or item, which are undoubtedly the worst moments of the game when playing it with modern eyes. And if there's anybody out there that gets upset at the idea of using assistance to enjoy this game, let me ask you a question. Would you rather people enjoy it whatever way is best for them, or not enjoy it at all because they're not playing it your way? With that in mind, I absolutely recommend you download and play Zelda 1, first to try it, and then with the manual or guide if you find that you do want to keep exploring and playing it to the very end. Or if you do want a very real challenge, just play it completely blind, it's up to you. Those of you like me that have already played and beaten the game before, maybe use this as an opportunity to finally try out that second quest. I know that's what I'll be doing. The original Mario Bros. Is probably a game that any of you with a Game Boy Advance played at some point. It was included in pretty much any of Mario's GBA endeavors, and is often still included in some Mario games today. This arcade classic puts you in the boots of Mario and Luigi as they try to clean out an underground sewer system. Like most arcade games from the 80s, this one is incredibly simple, featuring only 4 types of enemy. The Koopa, or I guess a Proto-Koopa, a crab, a bug, and this little ice creature that'll freeze platforms and make them slippery. Well, slipperier, that's a weird word to say, because the traction in Mario Bros. Is already really icy. There are 2 ways to deal with enemies. Either you can jump up from below and hit the platform they're on to flip them on their backs, or you can hit the POW block on the bottom level of the stage to flip every enemy at once. Once they're flipped, you can simply run into them to defeat them, which will spawn a coin from the upper pipes that you can collect for some bonus points. Do keep in mind that the POW block only has 3 uses before it disappears forever, the crabs take 2 hits to flip, not 1, and if you take too long defeating a flipped enemy, they'll flip back over and become faster. The enemies all follow a consistent pattern, always moving in one direction unless they hit a coin or another enemy, at which point they'll turn around. While the level design itself is essentially static, the game will get progressively harder and throw more and faster enemies at you as you move through the levels, until it caps out and loops at level 99. Odds are you're not getting anywhere close to level 99 though, so don't worry about that one too much. Like in many of the games we've covered so far, there's also a Game B option here, which starts off slightly harder. If you've played Mario Bros. Before, you've probably played a better version, as there's been 3 decades to clean up any bugs and slowdown that are present here in the NES release. Also, if you've played it before, you've pretty much played the entire game already, regardless of how many levels there are. There's no real need to come back to this one unless you want to experience your NES childhood for a few more minutes, or unless you've somehow never played it before and want to experience the first real Mario game. If you thought that WWE 2K18 had the worst frame rate of any wrestling game on the Switch, you would be wrong, as Pro Wrestling's got it beat. Of course, Pro Wrestling came out 30 years ago, so what's 2K18's excuse? Odds are you know at least a little bit about this game, as it's home to the infamous mistranslation, "A winner is you whenever you win a match." What you might not know because of that translation is that this game actually isn't horrible. In the game's single-player mode, you'll select one of 6 playable characters from around the world and wrestle your way up the rankings until you're the #1 contender for the VWA Championship. Once you win the strap, you'll be tasked with defending it 10 times, after which you'll challenge the game's final boss, the VWF champion, the Great Puma. The core gameplay is simple. You can press either the A or B button for different strikes and wrestling moves, and your goal is to beat your opponent down enough that they won't get back up from a 3-count pinfall. You can climb the top rope and execute jumping moves, you can run and clothesline your opponents, you can even jump over the top ropes and execute a diving plancha on your opponent if he's outside the ring. I'm beyond surprised with how much this game lets you do, but then maybe I shouldn't be. See, this game was developed by the same man who would later create the Fire Pro Wrestling series, often considered the best and most in-depth wrestling games of all time. Since I've been playing Fire Pro Wrestling World lately on the PS4, I slipped right into the mechanics, and it's kind of eerie seeing its influence. For example, there's no display telling you what your health or stamina levels are at. You have to gauge based on the moves that you've been hit with and listen for a low health jingle to play. This makes the more difficult matches that much more tense, even though the move animations are literally only 2 frames slapped together. The rest of the animations aren't that bad, don't get me wrong, but the move animations are a little bit weak. The game makes up for this with some smaller details, like having a cameraman in the foreground filming the action, or the game actually having a referee on screen, something I believe this game introduced first. The ref actually has to get into position to count the pins too, adding an extra layer of realism. I'm talking about realism in a game made in the late 80s. What happened in my life? Of course, for as fleshed out as the game seems to be, it can still very easily boil down to just pressing the kick button. I'm not joking, for most of the single player, you can just stand there and kick, and the AI will just keep standing back up, locking itself into this infinite loop of roundhouses. Or, if you want to get flashy, you can execute my preferred finishing move, the 7 Amigos. It's like the 3 Amigos, except instead you climb the top rope and dive onto your opponent 7 times in a row. In every wrestling game I've ever played, it works like a charm. Until it doesn't. Considering the system we're talking about here, though, the computer opponents are better than they have any right to be. I can't believe I'm saying this, but give this game a shot. After all, it's the best wrestling game available on Switch. God, that is sad to say. Developed by the same team behind Double Dragon, River City Ransom takes the beat-em-up formula and throws it in an open world with light RPG elements, while simultaneously scaling everything back down to focus around high schoolers. And I've gotta say, I had no idea what I was missing here, but wow, this game is so friggin' cool. You can freely explore this city at your will, although you will have to deal with a bunch of opposing gangs to do so. There are weapons like chains and, for some reason, car tires. You can throw your enemies, and all defeated enemies drop money. You can then spend that money at these designated mall areas, where you can enter shops and buy food to increase your stats, or books to give you new fighting abilities. That's so cool, and even though I've seen open worlds countless times in games, running through city streets on the NES somehow enthralled me. What I also love is that not only do enemies talk smack and also cry for their mothers when fighting, you can adjust the text speed at the very start of the game. Games today even forget to do that, and this game did it 29 years ago. If Double Dragon is the innovator of the beat-em-up genre, River City Ransom is the peak of the genre on the NES, hands down. There is so much charm, the game feels incredibly ahead of its time. I can't gush about it enough, and this is genuinely my first time playing it. And it will be even better now that there are save states on Switch, instead of having to worry about passwords for your stats. Give it a shot, especially if you have a buddy to play it with, either on your couch or over the web. I can't think you'll be disappointed by it. 1985's Soccer continues baseball's trend of incredibly slow sports games on the NES. The screen doesn't scroll quickly enough for the movement taking place on screen, and that's saying a lot considering this game runs at a snail's pace. In fact, I even found that the scrolling often gets caught for a second if you steal the ball while on defense and then quickly run back towards the opponent's half of the field. It seems like this delay is caused because, rather than dynamically scrolling, the game only has 3 different screens that it will move between, and it switches between them, again, incredibly slowly. Even better, if you want to switch to a defensive player, say if the ball is being launched across the field, you'll have to wait until after the screen is caught up, giving the computers a distinct advantage. Now that said, the computer-controlled characters on both teams are pathetic for the most part, although sometimes they'll surprise you and steal the ball from you. The goalies, though, are absolutely brain dead. Here, the game lets you pick exactly where you want to shoot, unlike in hockey where you just had to sort of aim for a general direction. But the goalies just run back and forth, usually hanging around the right side of the net and giving you a wide open Oh god, what is that? When you score, you celebrate like a muppet. What is that? Why is he flapping his arms? I am a bird! On higher skill levels, of course, the AI isn't nearly as brain dead, and in fact, once you get to level 5, they just start cheating, taking the ball well outside of the boundaries and rushing into the goalie box to steal a point. I would suggest playing on level 3 or so to make the games the most interesting. Of course, I wouldn't suggest playing this game at all, but if you really want to, by all means. At the very least, it's cool that the game lets you select how long you want each half of the game to be, just like in hockey. The most fun I had with soccer was playing online and laughing at, I am a bird! And even that only lasted one short game before we got bored and moved on. I would say your best bet is to take a hard pass on this one. Alright, time for the single most important game on this list, and I'm gonna keep this one brief. You already know what Super Mario Bros. Is, even if you've never played the very first game. Mario 1 is a 2D side-scrolling platformer released in 1985, featuring 32 levels. You'll run, jump, and occasionally swim your way past over a dozen different types of enemy, collecting coins and even power-ups like the Super Mushroom and Fire Flower. Levels follow a small handful of themes, from underground levels to underwater levels, even to the castles that act as boss levels for each of the game's 8 worlds. All the while, your goal is clear. Find Princess Toadstool at the end of every castle, hoping that this time you've actually found the right castle. It's not an exaggeration to say that at this point, easily 100 games have followed in the footsteps of Super Mario Bros. And even if you haven't played the game that started it all, you've probably played some of its levels, just remixed a bit throughout the years. Even over 30 years later, Super Mario Bros. 1 still holds up today, even if it's not as feature-packed or as polished as some of its sequels. If you haven't played it yet, I recommend you give it a shot now just to see what all the fuss is about. Just remember, if you're playing the game online and taking turns with a friend, that Luigi's trademark floaty jumps didn't become a thing until the next game, Japan's exclusive Super Mario Bros. 2, known stateside as the Lost Levels. Give that video a watch if you want to hear a much less enthusiastic and a much more shaven me talk about Mario for a bit. Alright, I can at least say a little bit more about this one. 1988's Super Mario Bros. 3 is a game that's held in such high regard even today that it usually finds a place near the top of most best games of all time lists. That's absolutely warranted, as Mario 3 is a masterclass in platformer design. Rather than focusing on the usual Mario tropes that have come to define both the old and the new Super Mario Bros. Games, Mario 3 went out there with its level design, featuring nearly as many levels as Super Mario Bros. 1, Lost Levels, and Mario 2 USA combined, while also throwing in 6 new power-ups, a branching overworld for each world, dozens of new enemies. If you love something from Mario that wasn't introduced in Super Mario Bros. 1, odds are it was introduced in this game here. That includes the Koopalings, who in the past several years have been brought back and thrown into practically every other Mario game, and even Smash Bros. There are some spikes that can sometimes get in the way of an otherwise smooth difficulty curve, but the best part about Mario 3 to me is that in the overworld, oftentimes you can choose to skip those problematic levels entirely. No longer is Mario a linear adventure through every world unless you can find a warp zone. No, now the adventure can be tweaked to your choosing. This adds tons of replayability, in addition to the new power-ups bringing different playstyles and often even more optional paths. And that's not even counting the optional item minigames and enemy encounters that pop up throughout the overworld. My absolute favorite ability in Mario 3, though, is Mario's ability to stop. See, in Mario 1, the controls were fine, but sometimes a little bit loose for my tastes. In Mario 3, I absolutely never feel concerned when jumping because Mario can stop on a dime in this game. I find myself every time I come back to this game going for riskier and riskier jumps because of how comfortably I can sit myself right back into these controls. They are as close to perfect as you can get on the NES. And as a result, death always feels like it's my fault. I can never blame the controls if I over or undershoot a jump because there's practically no excuse to do so with how malleable Mario's movements are on the fly. I could definitely keep going, but yet again, I reviewed Mario 3 back in 2016, so if you want my full 14 minutes worth of thoughts on the game, you can hear me gush much more over there. And if there's any concern about nostalgia, I do want to make it clear that I only beat Mario 3 for the first time back in about 2010. This game is a masterpiece on every single front, and everybody should give it a shot at least once. Almost universally considered the best sports title on the NES, Tecmo Bowl even gets lauded as one of the best sports games of all time. Unlike every other sports game on this current list, Tecmo Bowl very lightly replicates the actual abilities of the players and teams in question. This is because Tecmo was able to obtain the NFL Players Association license, and the game makes sure you know it by including actual stats from the previous NFL season as you're lining up for plays. Now, in most cases, the players are only marginally similar at best to real life, with the exception of the Raiders running back Bo Jackson, who is essentially unstoppable in this game to reflect how insane insane his performance was on the field. Instead of focusing on the players, the game focuses on making the teams feel accurate to their NFL counterparts. For example, the Giants have a killer defense, while the Dolphins rely entirely on Dan Marino's quarterbacking to pull the games together. In this version of the game, you can only choose from a handful of teams rather than the entire league, and teams only have 9 players on the field instead of 11 due to system limitations. Additionally, you're limited to 4 play options throughout the game, usually 2 run and 2 pass plays. Each team has a different playbook best suited to its players' abilities though, and this makes for some interesting and engaging matchups. Tecmo Bowl inspired an entire generation of football games, and even still, it holds up incredibly well today. Perhaps the most impressive thing is that they squeezed this entire game down from the arcades to the NES, kept the teams accurate, and still had some leftover space to include an announcer shouting for scoring plays. Even if you don't care much for football, this game is just pure fun, and for football fans like me, it's an absolute blast. If you choose to play just one sports game on this list, make it this one for sure. Sadly, for the current lineup of sports titles, we don't get to end on a high note like Tecmo Bowl, because now we have to talk about tennis. The highlight of this game is that Mario is the officiator for all of the matches. Everything else is about as fun as the horrible swing mode in Mario Tennis Aces. I'm just gonna come out and say this, don't try to play this like a regular tennis game, because you'll just run into the same problems that I did. For example, if you try to manipulate your shot's path by pressing the D-pad left or right, you're actually just gonna send your character sprinting off in that direction, letting the ball fly right by. The serving is more or less done for you, you just have to time your swing, and make sure not to move while the ball is in the air, because your character isn't locked in place, and you can just run away, which will cause a fault. The comparison to Ace's swing mode is sadly pretty apt too, as you can't really control your shot in any meaningful way. If you time your swing perfectly, you can get it to stay on the court, but anything beyond that is a crapshoot. And let's not forget to mention that this is the slowest tennis game I've ever played. Even if you play on a higher skill and speed level, while the game picks up a good bit in pace, the AI opponents are usually worse somehow. They mess up even more on hard than they do on easy, and they already mess up a lot on easy. There's no reason to play NES tennis at all, especially if you already have aces on your Switch. As bad as the swing mode may be, the rest of that game is excellent. In case you're bored of Dr. Mario, 1991's Yoshi will probably also bore you, actually. This is another game where blocks fall down and you'll have to match the block types. This time though, the blocks are Mario enemies, such as bloopers, Goombas, and piranha plants, and you only have to match 2 of each kind for them to disappear. In an interesting twist, you don't move the blocks around as they fall. Instead, you control Mario at the very bottom of the screen as he rotates the 4 columns around. I say interesting, but it's only really interesting for a couple rounds before the idea completely tires. The coolest concept here is the inclusion of Yoshi eggs. Occasionally included in the falling blocks is the bottom or top half of a Yoshi egg. If you place a top half in the same column as a bottom half, anything in between those two will be destroyed, and a Yoshi will hatch from that egg. Hatching Yoshis adds points to your score, but not much else. Other than these 2 wrinkles in the basic formula though, there's not much to write home about here. Yet again, there's an easier A mode and a harder B mode, with B mode this time beginning with blocks filling part of the screen. Even this doesn't add too much challenge, and playing a 2-player is slightly more fun, but it's only worth maybe a round or 2. Yoshi's certainly not as compelling as Dr. Mario, Tetris, or any Puyo Puyo game. It's probably best suited for much younger kids who may not be able to play those slightly harder games right away. I would say pass on this one unless you're really itching for a new puzzle game, but even then, you can do better. And there you have it, 20 games reviewed in what is far and away my biggest video that I've ever made. And that's saying a lot because I've made a friggin' documentary on this channel before. Before I go, I do want to touch on 2 last things, my methodology behind each review, and then, very briefly, the NES app itself. For 14 of these 20 games, I've completely beaten the game, either while recording footage or at some point in the past few years. In 3 more cases, I've either gotten to the final level but not taken down the final boss, or played a more than significant portion of the game, far more than I felt was necessary to begin writing down my critical thoughts. For example, I didn't beat Mario Bros because there are 99 levels, but I've played more than enough Mario Bros over the years, and the game doesn't exactly change much. In only 3 cases did I not play at least a third of the way through to full completion: Ghosts and Goblins, Gradius, and River City Ransom. In these cases though, I did still follow my general game plan when reviewing the free PS Plus games in my Plus One series, and that's to play either at least 10 to 20% of the game or a full hour of gameplay during my recording session, whichever takes longer. The reason for this is that there's a near 0% of games that change significantly after you've made your way 10% of the way in, and those that do don't take much longer than an hour to beat. In these three cases, I felt comfortable enough after my time with each game to give my thoughts and know who I would recommend each of these games for. After all, it only takes a minute to download the NES app on your Switch and try them yourself. I'm just here to help you decide which ones you should dive into first. And last but not least, let's talk about the NES app. At first I wasn't a big fan of the way these games are laid out. It feels a bit clunky to just throw all the games into one big interactive collage, as if you're a kid who's thrown all their games on the floor before deciding which one to play. But over time, it kind of grew on me, especially since you can reorganize the games in whatever order you'd like. The rest of the UI is solid enough, although I do have to question why you can't turn off the text underneath the game screen or the banners on the side. It's not a huge deal, but the text especially is ever so slightly distracting at first, especially since the NES Classic nailed it with the blank background. Everything else is essentially just a reskinned NES Classic. Each game has 4 save state slots, you can quickly suspend the game, go back to the menu, and swap between games, and there are the exact same pixel perfect and CRT video modes in addition to the standard 4:3 aspect ratio. Again, they literally just took the NES Classic and ported the software over, which sadly also means that like the NES Classic, there's no way to remap the buttons on your Switch controllers, which is a big downer for me. Simple quality of life additions like that go a long way, and for a company that loves to tout how player-friendly it is and how many controller options it has, yeah, that kinda rings a bit hollow looking at this. Also, in another questionable omission, unlike the NES Classic, the Switch doesn't give you the option to look at the game's manuals. Now, given, the NES made you take a picture of a QR code with your phone to do so, but still, the manuals would have been extremely helpful here instead of a random paragraph description of each game on the menu. Oh boy, my voice is going to regret this one tomorrow. I'm already starting to get a little bit hoarse, so I'm going to call it quits soon. Thank you very much for watching if you made it all the way through, and if you did, make sure you hit the like button down below and share it out with any of your friends, as sharing videos and liking really does help this channel grow. And if you want to see this become a regular series, let me know down in the comments below. I can absolutely continue this, similar to my Plus One series. I just need to make sure that you guys want to see that as a series going forward. As always, thank you again very much for watching. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe for more of this kind of video and many, hopefully, much shorter videos. As always, stay golden.